Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into Matthew chapter 16, verse 6, where Jesus gives this really fascinating warning. Be careful, he said to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, at first glance, that might just sound like a simple dietary heads up. But as we're going to see today, it's actually a profound diagnosis of the human heart. We're talking about the unseen, silent influence of bad doctrine. Let's jump in and see what Jesus really meant, how his closest followers completely missed the point at first, and why this specific warning is absolutely crucial for us right now.
But before we get into the weeds, let's quickly outline the big picture. First, we'll decode what this bad yeast actually is. Second, we'll look at the historical context. Third, we'll compare the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Fourth, we'll explore how these ideas spread invisibly. Fifth, we'll break down the implications for college students today. And finally, we'll talk about how to actively guard your heart.
Okay, let's get into section 1, watch out for bad yeast, and decoding a misunderstood warning. So Jesus issues this really stark warning right after a massive confrontation with the religious leaders. And honestly, his own disciples completely miss the point. They hear the word yeast and immediately start panicking because they forgot to pack literal bread for their boat ride. But Jesus wasn't giving baking advice. Yeast here is a metaphor. It represents wrong teaching, wrong priorities, and fundamentally a wrong posture of the heart. From a Reformed theological perspective, this perfectly highlights our inherent tendency to be corrupted by sin and false teaching from the inside out. It's pervasive and it's dangerous. Moving on to section 2, the historical context, reading the sky but missing the signs. To understand exactly why Jesus was so intense about this, we have to look at what had literally just happened. The Pharisees and Sadducees had just marched up to him, demanding a sign from heaven. Now, keep in mind, they had just watched him perform healing after healing, miracle after miracle. Yet they have the nerve to ask for another sign. Jesus outright refuses. He points out their willful blindness, telling them, you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Basically, they can perfectly predict the weather by looking up, but they are totally missing the divine reality standing right in front of them.
And the real issue here isn't a lack of intellectual proof. It's a deep-seated heart issue. They already had the evidence. They just didn't have the will to accept it. Asking for another sign? That was just a stalling tactic. It was their way of refusing to fully commit to him while still trying to look religiously observant and open-minded. Jesus sees right through it and identifies the stubborn resistance as incredibly dangerous.
Let's look at section 3, Pharisees versus Sadducees, two dangerous teachings. So what made their teaching so toxic? Well, it really comes down to two dominant theological extremes. On one side, you have the Pharisees. They were all about strict external performance, following the rules, looking super holy on the outside, but completely ignoring the heart and the radical grace of God. On the other side, you have the Sadducees. They were the rationalists of their day. They completely denied the supernatural, including the resurrection, which essentially turned faith into a this-world-only project. Jesus is saying both of these extremes, legalistic performance and secularized religion, are deadly yeast. Section 4, the invisible spread, how bad doctrine actually works. So why use the metaphor of yeast? Well, think about how dough rises. You don't actually see it happen in real time, right? It works silently. It infiltrates gradually. And that is exactly how bad doctrine works. It slowly reshapes how you think about God, the gospel, and what following Jesus actually looks like. It doesn't usually happen with some massive overnight theological shift. It's the small, almost imperceptible compromises in our minds and hearts over time. You really have to watch out for these characteristics. The absolute scariest part of this invisible spread is that it often sounds totally Christian. It uses gospel language, but it strips out the actual message of grace, repentance, and resurrection hope. We have to remember that just because a message uses all the right spiritual vocabulary, it doesn't mean it's actually shaped by the Bible. This yeast of performance or worldly thinking can totally take over if we aren't actively on guard. That brings us to section 5, implications for college students. Translating the warning for today. Let's bring this right into the modern day. What does this mean for a college student, especially if you're heavily involved in a Christian community or church summer programs? Well, the findings present a pretty challenging reality. You can be deeply immersed in Bible study, surrounded by a great community, highly active in ministry, and yet still fundamentally hold Jesus at arm's length. Just like those Pharisees who knew the scriptures backward and forward but missed God himself standing in front of them, you can be soaking in biblical content while refusing to actually yield your will and fully commit. And this is the big challenge for all of us, recognizing the gap between our minds and our actions.
Look at the difference between acceptance and resistance here. Intellectual acceptance is when you read the Bible, you nod your head, you totally agree with the theology. But practical resistance, that's when you're constantly demanding more confirmation, waiting for another sign, or needing the perfect circumstances before you actually obey what God has already made clear. You possess the evidence, but you just lack the will to act.
Section 6. Guarding your heart. How to actually live this out. So how do we stop this invisible spread? The research outlines a really clear step-by-step process. Step 1. Start with some brutal honesty. Ask yourself right now if there's an area in your life where you're waiting for just one more sign before obeying God. Step 2. Practice full engagement. When you study the Bible, don't just be a passive observer soaking up facts. Give yourself over to the process of actual transformation. And step 3. Be the person who notices when your community's culture is drifting, like when performance starts replacing grace or this world thinking replaces true hope. Following these steps is how you actively guard your heart.
Which brings us to the clear conclusion of this research. You've got to go deeper than just absorbing content. Real faith requires action. The ultimate antidote to the stalling tactics of the Pharisees and the over-intellectualizing of the Sadducees is simply faithful obedience. Take one step of obedience today based on what you already know is true from the Bible. Trust that God has given you enough evidence and step out in faith. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to reflect on today. Is there an area of your life right now where you've been demanding more confirmation from God before obeying something He's already made abundantly clear? Take a minute to really examine the true reason for your delay. Are you waiting on God, or is God actually waiting on you? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep guarding your heart, and I will see you next time.